Without objection.
This amendment I tried in 2008 Farm Bill, got 57 votes for it, but it was under a 60-vote rule, so obviously it didn't get adopted. This amendment,
Please.
This amendment would cap payments that one farmer can get on marketing loans and loan deficiency payments. We can't have 70% of the farm payments going to 10% of the largest farmers. I think this will help add integrity to the program. We should have caps on Title I commodity programs. This will add defensibility to this bill, along with the payment limit reform that we were able to put in the committee before the bill was voted out. Opponents will argue, I'm sure you'll hear this argument, that this would increase forfeitures of crops, but I believe that they're overstating the issue, especially given current prices, and even if a farmer did forfeit
The
crops.
senator's time has expired.
Well, Mr. President, this is a common sense amendment. I hope you'll vote for it.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
Senator from Georgia.
Mr. President, I rise in opposition to this amendment. Limiting MLGs and LDPs is disruptive to orderly marketing because USDA lacks the ability in real time to track eligibility from
Order. We do not have order yet. Order, please.
And consequently, a producer may exceed his loan limit under this amendment, and USDA have no idea that he's exceeded his loan limit, so he's going to have to come back later on and obviously repay that in very difficult times. Most farming operations secure financing for annual production costs as well as incur their long-term debt for equipment and land. And introducing limits on marketing loan benefits makes this financing more difficult to obtain and more difficult to administer from a farmer standpoint as well as a banking standpoint. So I urge opposition to the amendment.
The question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barraza. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Dement, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Akaka, Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Begich, Bennett, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown of Ohio, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Coates, Coburn, Collins, Coons, Corker, DeMint, Durbin, Enzi, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Grassley, Heller, Inouye, Johans, Johnson of South Dakota, Klobuchar, Cole, Kyle, Lautenberg, Lee, Lieberman, Lugar, Manchin, McCain, McCaskill, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murray, Nelson of Nebraska, Hall, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Roberts, Rockefeller, Rubio, Shaheen, Snow, Stabenow, Tester, Toomey, Udall of New Mexico, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Webb, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Cochran, Cornyn, Graham, Hagan, Hutchison, Inhofe, Isaacson, Landrieu, Leahy, Moran, Sanders, Sessions, Shelby, Vitter, Warner, Wicker. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Pryor, no. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Hoeven, no. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Nelson of Florida, aye. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, aye. Mr. Carey, aye.
Okay, are there any senators wishing to vote or change their vote? Hearing none, the ayes are 75, the nays are 24. The amendment is adopted.
Mr. President,
Senator from Ohio.
I call it my amendment, Brown 2445.
Clerk will report.
Senator from Ohio, Mr. Brown, proposes an amendment number 2445.
The reading be dispensed with, Mr. President.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President.
There are 2 minutes of debate equally divided. Let's have order for the debates, please.
Mr. President, Congress has provided an average of $400 million per farm bill to the rural development title. The bill we're considering today includes no funding at all. My fiscally responsible amendment funds rural business development programs, a portion of the backlog of wastewater infrastructure projects, and will help bring a new generation of farmers into agriculture.
Order, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. As a member of the Agriculture Committee, I know how important it is that this amendment maintains our committee's commitment to save at least $23 billion in the Farm Bill. I yield the rest of my time to Senator Chairwoman Stabenow.
Mr. President, let me just add my strong support for the amendment. We have reformed this title on rural development. We've eliminated 16 different authorizations, tightened it up. The amendment stays within our parameters of $23 billion in deficit reduction and affects every small town and community across America who count on rural development. And I would strongly support this amendment.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Kansas.
Mr. President, I oppose this amendment. I do so reluctantly with my colleague on the committee, but the committee bill contains no mandatory funding. In the rural development title, this amendment would take savings achieved in the bill from 23.4, it used to be 26.3, now we're down to 23.4. That would take it down to 23.2 and redirect the $150 million mandatory spending into a few rural development programs. Nothing against them, but if we're going to achieve savings in this bill, we've got to hold the line. I reluctantly oppose the bill. I don't reluctantly oppose the bill. Heck, I oppose it.
The question is on the amendment. All. Is there a sufficient second? Appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. DeMint. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Akaka, Begich, Bennett, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown of Ohio, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coons, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Inouye, Johnson of South Dakota, Kerry, Klobuchar, Cole, Lautenberg, Leahy, Levin, Lieberman, Manchin, Merkley, Mikulski, Murray, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Webb, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Heller, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Conrad, aye. Mr. Udall, Colorado, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown of Massachusetts, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, DeMint, Enzi, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kyle, Lee, Lugar, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Hall, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Sessions, Snow, Thune, Toomey, Wicker. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, no. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Vitter, no. Mr. Hoeven. Mr. Hoeven, no. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, aye. Mrs. Hutchison. Mrs. Hutchison, no. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, no. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, no.
Okay, are there any senators wishing to vote or to change their vote? Hearing none, the ayes are 55, the nays are 44. The amendment carries. Okay.
Mr. President,
The senator from Alabama, and there'll be order.
I would call up amendment number 2174.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Alabama, Mr. Sessions, proposes amendment number 2174.
Mr. President, food stamp spending has quadrupled, gone up 4 times since 2001, increasing twice the rate that our other major poverty program, Medicaid, has increased. It's now the second largest of nearly 80 federal welfare programs. An individual on food stamps with all other government programs they may be eligible for can receive as much as $25,000 a year. Under this bill, food stamps will average $80 billion a year for 10 years, whereas the agriculture farm programs will average $20 billion a year. It's by far the dominant factor in this entire piece of legislation. So number 2174 deals with a problem through a system known as categorical eligibility. 43 states now provide benefits to individuals whose incomes exceed the statutory limit, incomes and assets. Only 11 states did that in 2007.
Senator's time has expired.
Mr. President, I would ask that we be able to fix this problem and urge our colleagues to vote aye.
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I strongly urge a no vote. We actually rejected this amendment last fall. I ask that we do it again. It's true that food assistance help has gone up as the economy has had a rough time. As unemployment goes up, food costs go up. Unemployment is coming down, and in this bill we reflect savings as the economy is getting better. Food help goes down. It's no different than crop insurance helping the farmer in a disaster. This is helps families in a disaster. Unfortunately, this amendment would completely change the structure of food help. It would dramatically affect children and families. It, for example, would affect someone's ability to get to work because the value of their car would somehow be reflected in a way that would require them to possibly give up their car when they're trying to get to work in order to be able to put food help on the table for their families. It makes no sense at all. This bill has common sense reforms to make sure the goes where it should. I urge a no vote.
The question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. DeMint, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, DeMint, Enzi, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Hoeven, Hutchison, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kyle, Lee, Lugar, McCain, Moran, Paul, Risch, Rubio, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Wicker. Mr. Portman, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Vitter, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Akaka, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Conrad, Coons, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heller, Inouye, Johnson of South Dakota, Kerry, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Leahy, Levin, Lieberman, Manchin, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murray, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schumer, Shaheen, Snow, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Webb, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Pryor, no. Mr. Udall, Colorado, no. Mr. Cole, no. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken, no.
On this vote, are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? Hearing none, on this vote, Sessions Amendment number 2174. The yeas are 43, the nays are 56. The amendment is not agreed to. The senator from Washington.
Madam President, I call up amendment number 2370.
Clerk will report. The senator from Washington, Ms. Cantwell, proposes amendment number 2370.
Further reading be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise in support of this amendment with my colleague, Senator Murray, and others to include in the school lunch program a pilot program dealing with dried beans, peas, lentils, and chickpeas. My amendment works to improve the nutritional value of school meals across America at a very economical price, with the level of school obesity for children between 2 and 19. This is very important that we have this program included, and I'd like to yield 30 seconds to my colleague from South Dakota.
Without objection.
Thank you,
Senator from South Dakota.
North Dakota.
North Dakota.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Senator Cantwell. I rise to speak in support of this amendment. I co-sponsored the legislation. It would provide that pulse crops, peas, beans, and lentils are used in the school lunch program. It does not add additional cost. They're a high source of protein, very cost-effective, and it's a growing, no pun intended, crop in our country. Thank you.
Madam President.
The senator from Kansas.
Yes, Madam President, I'm supportive of this amendment, but I have been noticed that a recorded vote has been requested, and so I ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there a second? There appears to be. There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Dement, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen.
Aye.
I got you. Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, I got you, sir. Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester,
Aye.
Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Akaka, Bennett, Bingaman, Brown of Ohio, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Conrad, Coons, Crapo, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Hoeven, Inouye, Johans, Johnson of South Dakota, Klobuchar, Cole, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Leahy, Lieberman, Lugar, Manchin, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Moran, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Pryor, Rita Bird Island, Risch, Roberts, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schumer, Shaheen, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Webb, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Corker. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus. Aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray. Aye. Mr. Hatch. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow. Aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin. Aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich. Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown of Massachusetts, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Corker, Cornyn, Dement, Enzi, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hutchison, Isaacson, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kyle, Lee, McCain, McConnell, Murkowski, Paul, Portman, Rubio, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Ms. Snow, no. Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, no. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, aye.
Vote or wishing to change their vote? Hearing none. The yeas are 58, the nays are 41. The amendment is agreed to.
Madam President,
The senator from Nebraska.
Madam